Hello everyone.
Hello everyone.
This is our secondary channel. Many of you asked us to tell more stories, share more moments.
And explore the parts of our journey that don't always fit on the main channel. So here we are.
James and Diep thought they had finally made it. Their orange farm was in full harvest. The first big contract for DJ Company was about to change their lives. Until one morning, everything crashes at once. James begins to break under the weight of debt and shame, and someone in the shadows clearly wanted them to fall. Diep is forced to become the strong one, holding the family together while quietly uncovering clues that point to a terrifying possibility. The person who destroyed their dream might be closer than James could ever imagine. Will their love survive after losing everything? And what will happen when the full truth finally reaches James? If you want to follow every twist of James and Diep's story and see how they rise again from nothing, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next episode. The morning the world collapsed began like any other good day. Diep tightened the strap of the woven basket against her hip and started up the dirt path, the cold breath of dawn still clinging to the hillside. Mist curled around her ankles. The first light of the sun washed the tops of the orange trees in a pale gold, turning each fruit into a soft, glowing lantern. From a distance, the orchard looked perfect. Rows and rows of trees, heavy with the promise of harvest and of a future she and James had dared to believe in. Her boots crunched on the dry soil. Birds chattered somewhere high above, waking up as if greeting her return. Today, she whispered to herself, smiling, we start delivering for the big contract. The word contract made her heart flutter. For months, she and James had worked like people running on borrowed time, checking every branch, fixing every leak in the irrigation lines, negotiating with workers, begging suppliers to give them just a few more weeks of grace. It had all led to this morning. First harvest, first shipment, first real proof that DJ wasn't just a dream scratched into the dirt by two stubborn people. She reached the first row and slipped one hand under a branch, fingers brushing the cool skin of a ripe orange. Her smile faded. The leaf under her thumb was not thick and glossy green. It was limp, yellowing around the edges as if burned by an invisible fire. Diep frowned and pushed the branch aside to see more clearly. Several leaves were curled and brittle. A few oranges lay on the ground nearby, not gently dropped by wind, but collapsed. Their skins mottled with dark patches, like bruises spreading from the inside. That's strange, she murmured. She moved on, telling herself it was just one tree, just one row. Every orchard had a few sick trees. Nothing is perfect. But at the second row, the same jagged yellowing appeared, leaves hanging like tired hands, fruits with blackened spots at the stem. A sour, chemical scent floated faintly in the air, wrong and sharp against the usual earthy sweetness of the soil. By the third row, her steps slowed. Her breath came shorter, as if the air itself had thickened. This wasn't a small patch. This was more. She reached out to a branch near eye level and snapped off a twig. It didn't give the way a healthy branch did. It bent, soft and rubbery before it broke, the inside pulpy and weirdly wet. A thin line of sap oozed out, not clear and sticky, but cloudy, with a faint yellow tint. Diep's heart pounded harder. No, 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 no. She knelt and touched the soil at the base of the tree. It was damp in a strange pattern, a dark ring around the trunk, as if something had been poured there recently. The smell was stronger down here, a harsh, biting scent that had nothing to do with fertilizer or medicine she knew. Her fingers brushed against plastic. She shifted aside the top layer of soil and pulled up a small, color-faded can. The label had been scratched off, but sticky, dried residue clung to the rim. She shook it. Empty. Someone had used this. Here, in her orchard. Her throat tightened. This wasn't disease. This wasn't bad weather. This was deliberate. Her vision blurred for a moment, but she didn't cry. She stood slowly, her legs trembling, and looked out across the hillside. Now that she was paying attention, the pattern was clear. It wasn't just one tree, or one row. The damage was scattered like a cruel pattern across almost the entire slope, as if someone had walked methodically through her life's work, pouring death into the roots. Her phone felt heavy in her hand when she pulled it from her pocket. She scrolled quickly and called the first number that came to mind. An Hui, she said when the manager picked up, her voice already strange to her own ears. Come up to the Orange Hill. Now. Bring everyone. Something is wrong. Very wrong. He started to ask a question, but she ended the call and, for a second, just stood there in the growing light, the basket still empty at her side. She had walked up the hill, ready to harvest a future. Instead, she had walked into a graveyard. James didn't pick up on the first call. Deep tried again as she waited for the workers to arrive. Her fingers were cold despite the rising sun. On the second call, he answered, voice sleepy and warm. Hey, good morning. Are you on the hill already? Take some photos for... James. Something in her tone made him stop mid-sentence. What happened? He asked immediately. She looked around as if the orchard could hear her. You need to come. The oranges... I don't know how to say this. They're dying. A lot of them. He sat up somewhere far away, sheets rustling, the bed shifting under his weight. She could imagine it clearly, even from here. Dying? Like pests? Or... Not pests, she cut in. It smells like... chemicals. There's a can near the roots. I think someone poured something. On purpose. There was a long silence on the line, broken only by her unsteady breathing and the distant hum of an approaching motorbike on the road below. Okay, James said finally, his voice low, controlled in a way that told her he was already pushing his panic down. Don't touch anything else. Don't move the can. I'll be there as fast as I can. Call Hui, call the agronomist, call anyone we can get to check it. Just don't be alone up there, okay? I'm fine, she lied. She wasn't. When she hung up, the quiet rushed in again, thick with the rustling of poisoned leaves. A gust of wind blew through the branches, and a small rain of dead leaves fell around her feet like confetti from a celebration gone wrong. By the time the first worker reached the hilltop, Deep had walked every row she could. The story was the same everywhere. Some trees were almost untouched, green, strong, stubbornly holding onto their fruits. But far too many were already beyond saving. The pattern of wet soil around the trunks, the unnatural smell, the suddenness of the damage, it all pointed in one direction. This was not an accident. Chi! Hui stopped beside her, breathing hard from the climb, eyes sweeping the slope. What happened here? Look at the soil, Diep said. Her voice sounded flat to her ears now, as if it belonged to someone else. Smell it. He knelt, sniffed, then jerked his head back. This isn't any fertilizer we use. This is... something else. The agronomist arrived half an hour later, still zipping up his jacket, a notebook under his arm. He moved from tree to tree, cutting small samples of leaves, scraping bark, filling tiny bags with soil. His face grew more serious with each step. James appeared not long after, his black pickup truck skidding to a stop near the lower path. He didn't walk. He almost ran up the hill, breath loud in the quiet orchard. When he spotted Dieppe standing among the trees, he slowed, as if afraid that moving too fast would make this more real. "How bad is it?" he asked. She didn't answer with words. She just pointed. He turned, really looking for the first time. His eyes widened as he took in the curling leaves, the scattered, blackened fruit, the weird, angry patches on the trunks. He stepped closer to one tree, then another, every line of his body tightening. "Tell me this is just a few rows?" he said, barely above a whisper. Dieppe shook her head. The agronomist walked over, holding his samples like evidence. "I can't say everything for sure yet," he told them. "But it doesn't look like a natural disease. The pattern is wrong. It looks intentional. Like something toxic was introduced through the roots. Whatever it is, it's fast-acting. You might have noticed nothing yesterday and wake up to this today." "How many trees?" James asked. He swallowed. "Almost all the ones ready for harvest." James's jaw clenched. "And that's the part we need for the contract." Nobody had to answer. The silence was enough. DJ had not been born in a boardroom. It started on a rainy afternoon when James, who had once worn tailored suits and signed papers under the marble ceilings of his father's company, found himself standing under Dieppe's plastic tarpaulin at the local market, holding an umbrella over her crates of oranges. People had been avoiding her stall that day because the rain was too cold, because the mud was too thick, because the sky had opened up at the worst possible moment. She'd looked tired, but still managed to joke about her oranges needing customers who weren't afraid of a little dirt. James had laughed, even though nothing in his life had felt funny then. He'd been newly unemployed, freshly rejected, torn out of his old world like a page ripped from a book. His father had called him foolish, naive, reckless for choosing a poor girl and her small life over a concrete future in the family empire. But under that dripping tarpaulin, with Dieppe's hands stained with soil and the smell of citrus cutting through the damp air, something had felt right. "Your oranges are better than anything I've ever tasted," he had told her after biting into one, juice running down his wrist. She had rolled her eyes. "You're just hungry." "I'm serious," he'd insisted. "You're sitting on a gold mine and you don't even know it." That was the first seed of DJ. Months later, they registered the company. DJ, Diep James. Their initials, their stubbornness, their shared belief that quality and honesty could still mean something in a world where everything felt bought and calculated. They started with small orders, then bigger ones. Slowly, the name DJ began to mean something to people beyond their tiny town. Restaurants called back for second deliveries. Market vendors asked for that orange from the gentle girl and her foreign-educated boyfriend. It was clumsy, difficult, exhausting, but it was theirs. The big contract had come almost like a miracle. A regional supermarket chain wanted to test locally sourced, clean fruit. They needed consistent volume, consistent quality, and someone willing to commit long-term. DJ, with its passionate founders and growing reputation, had gotten a chance to pitch. Diep had worn her best shirt. James had worn his only decent blazer left from his old life, shoulders slightly worn, but still sharp. "This contract," the representative had said, tapping the papers on the table, "could secure your cash flow for at least 2 years. It will also test your limits. If you fail to deliver, the penalty is severe. Are you sure you want to sign?" James had glanced at Dieppe. Her eyes had been bright with fear and hope. "We can do it," she had whispered. He had believed her. They'd signed. Now, standing in the ruined orchard, those signatures felt like another kind of poison. The meeting with their lawyer and the supermarket representative took place 2 days after the discovery. Those 2 days were a blur of running tests, calculating losses, and watching more trees slip past the point of rescue. The agronomist's final report was clear. Foreign chemicals, not registered in any of the standard agricultural lists they used. Purposeful contamination. In the small office of DJ, the supermarket representative sat with his arms crossed, fingers drumming on the table. He looked tired, not angry, but under that tiredness was steel. "I'm sorry for what happened," he said. "Truly. But you must understand, our shelves cannot be empty. We made commitments to our customers based on your commitments to us." James nodded numbly. "I know. We can't meet the volume anymore, not even close." The lawyer slid the contract across the table, his pen resting near the clause on penalties. As per this section, failure to deliver the agreed quantity without force majeure leads to financial compensation equal to... He named a number. It was just a series of digits, but as they hung in the air, they felt like a weight crushing the room. It was more money than James and Dieppe had ever seen in one place. More than their entire profit from the past year. More than they could pay even if they sold the truck, the equipment, the land, and maybe their souls. Dieppe's fingers dug into the fabric of her pants beneath the table, nails biting her skin. She forced herself to speak. "We were sabotaged," she said quietly. "Someone poisoned our orchard. This was not incompetence. It was a crime." "I understand," the representative replied. "But on paper, there is no clause for sabotage. We both took risks. I'm already pushing my management to reduce the penalty as much as possible, but there will still be consequences. I can't just explain to my board that your trees died because someone was jealous." Jealous. The word sat there, ugly and accurate. After the meeting, James stood by the window for a long time, staring at nothing. The late afternoon sun painted the dust in the air gold, as if mocking them with its beauty. "Maybe your father was right," he said finally, his voice hoarse. "Maybe this was crazy from the start. We were playing big without having any protection. One disaster, and we're done." Dieppe flinched at the mention of his father. His shadow had never really left them. James's father had not been impressed when his son announced he was leaving the family company. "You're going to trade international contracts for oranges?" he had asked, eyebrows arching in disbelief. "For a life I choose," James had answered. His father had laughed, a short, sharp sound. "You think that girl and her little farm are worth throwing away everything you've built?" "She's not just that girl," James had said. "Her name is Dieppe. And this isn't about throwing something away. It's about building something new." His father's smile had turned cold. "You don't know the world you're walking into. Agriculture is messy, unstable. One storm, one disease, one wrong move, and everything is gone. In my world, I can control things, protect you. Out there, you won't last a year." He had leaned forward. "Come back to the company. Marry someone appropriate. Let me handle your future." James had refused. "Then don't blame me," his father had said, "when the world teaches you the lesson I tried to spare you from." Those words echoed in James's mind now, louder than any number on a contract. The first real clue came not from a big revelation, but from Hui's casual frustration. He and Dieppe were in the storeroom, going through boxes and paperwork, trying to piece together anything that could help them prove sabotage. The air smelled of dust and dried fertilizer. A broken fan whirred weakly overhead. I still don't understand how someone could get close enough to the trees, Hui muttered, flipping through a logbook. We have cameras near the entrance. The workers sleep not that far from the irrigation system. No one saw anything? He paused, then frowned. Actually, there was that truck. Diep looked up. What truck? 3 nights before harvest, he said slowly. One of the night guards mentioned a small delivery truck driving up halfway, then turning around. I thought it was just someone lost. We didn't order anything that night, though. Her heart gave a small, painful kick. Show me the logs from last week, she said. They went through the entries. There it was, handwritten by the guard. Unknown white truck, no logo, turned back at mid-slope, approximately 10 p.m. And the chemicals? Diep asked. Anything new in the past month? He hesitated. There was one batch I didn't recognize. I thought you had approved it with the supplier directly. I didn't, she said. They checked the invoice. The company name was unfamiliar, generic, almost too clean. Green Sun Agricultural Solutions. No logo, just a phone number and an address in a nearby city. Who ordered this? She whispered. Hui shrugged helplessly. The form came through email. It had your name typed at the bottom. I didn't question it. Diep stared at the paper. Something was wrong. The spelling of her name was slightly off. Deep without the accent marks was normal, but the way the letters were spaced, the formatting, the tone of the text. It didn't feel like hers. It felt like someone had imitated her. She copied the phone number into her own mobile and stepped outside, where the air was cooler and smelled less like dust and failure. The call connected after several rings. Green Sun Agricultural, a male voice answered. Yes, hello, she said, forcing her voice steady. I'm calling from DJ Company. We received a shipment of chemicals from you recently. I have some questions about the product. There was a pause on the line. Too long. I'm sorry, the man said. You must be mistaken. We don't have any client under that name. I'm looking at the invoice right now, Diep insisted. Your company name, your number, the signature? I think you have the wrong Green Sun, he interrupted, his tone now colder. We don't send products without contracts and proper registration. If someone used our name, it wasn't us. Goodbye. He hung up before she could say another word. She lowered the phone slowly. Used our name. Someone had gone to the trouble of creating a fake invoice, using a real company's name and number, but routing the actual product from somewhere else. Someone who knew how this world worked, who knew how to cover tracks just enough that it would take too long, too much money, for small people like her and James to chase the truth. Her mind scrolled through all the people who might want to hurt them. Competitors? They barely had any. Angry neighbors? Maybe, but they wouldn't have the sophistication to fake invoices. Random criminals? It felt too targeted for that. The list of people with motive and resources was short. Horribly short. In a high-rise office, far from the smell of soil and citrus, a man in a dark suit glanced out at the city skyline. James's father listened as his assistant finished the report. The small company you asked about, DJ, the assistant said. They've suffered a major crop failure. Looks like contamination. They won't be able to fulfill their supermarket contract. There's talk of penalties. Financially, they're in serious trouble. The older man nodded slowly, fingers tapping the arm of his leather chair. And there is nothing that can be traced back to us? No, sir, the assistant replied. We operated through a shell supplier, and even that used a borrowed name. The chemicals were unmarked. As far as anyone can tell, it's just an unfortunate case of sabotage by no one in particular. No one in particular? Convenient. The father's gaze drifted to a framed photograph on the shelf. James, younger, in a graduation gown, smiling with a mix of pride and uncertainty. He remembered the day had been hot. He remembered thinking his son could have anything in the world. And now that son had chosen oranges and a girl from the countryside over the empire built over decades. "I didn't want this," he said, more to himself than to his assistant. But sometimes, children don't understand until the world teaches them. He wanted to see what happens when you step out from under my protection. Now he sees. "Do you think he will come back?" the assistant asked carefully. "He will have to," the father replied. "There is only so many times you can start over before the weight becomes too much. When he finally breaks, he will remember that I offered him stability. And I," he added, a shadow crossing his face, "will decide whether to open the door." He stood and straightened his tie. "Until then," he said, "we watch. No direct contact. I don't want him thinking I had anything to do with this. Let him believe it's just bad luck." He turned away from the window. Somewhere far from his cool, air-conditioned office, a woman named Diep was standing in the twilight outside a small warehouse, holding a fake invoice in her hand and feeling a cold understanding creep into her bones. That night, DJ's office was quiet. The workers had gone home. The lights in the orchard were off. Only one dim lamp glowed above the desk where James sat, staring at columns of numbers that refused to make sense. Diep watched him from the doorway for a moment, the crumpled invoice in her pocket like a piece of metal burning against her side. He looked older in that light, not in his face, but in the slope of his shoulders, in the way his hands hung limp over the calculator, as if they had given up trying to fix what was broken. "Did you eat?" she asked softly. He shook his head without looking up. "Not hungry?" She stepped closer. "We'll figure something out." "How?" he asked. He finally lifted his eyes to hers. There was no anger there, only exhaustion. "Even if we somehow borrow enough to pay part of the penalty, we still lose the contract, our reputation, the orchard. Who will trust DJ after this? We're finished, Diep." The word finished made her flinch. For a moment, she wanted to pull the invoice from her pocket, lay it on the table, and tell him everything she suspected. "Your father did this. He wanted to prove he was right. He wanted to break you so you would crawl back." But she hesitated. James was already drowning. Throwing this truth at him now might be the stone that pulled him under for good. So she swallowed the words and only said, "We're not finished. Not as long as we're still here." He looked at her as if he wanted to believe that, but couldn't see the path yet. She reached out and rested her hand over his. "You once told me," she reminded him, "that what makes us different is that we don't give up when things get hard. You said we picked oranges in the rain when other people stayed home. We'll find another way. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but we will." Silence. Then a tiny nod. She squeezed his fingers, then stepped back, her heart heavy with the secret pressing against her ribs. Later, when he finally went home to check on Nee and try to sleep, Diep sat alone at the desk, the lamp buzzing softly above her. She took the invoice out and laid it flat. Her eyes traced the fake company name, the borrowed phone number, the carefully forged signature. She saw not just paper, but intent, power. A hand reaching into their life and squeezing, simply because it could. "Why?" she whispered into the empty office. Why isn't it enough to let him go? Why do you have to crush everything he builds without you? She pictured James's father, the way he had looked at her at that one awkward dinner they had shared, his gaze polite yet sharp, evaluating her like a bad investment. Maybe she was wrong. Maybe she was right. Either way, one thing was clear. Losing the orchard, the contract, and almost everything they had built was not an accident. It was a message. And even if James couldn't read it yet, Dieppe could. Outside, the night settled over the silent rows of trees, sick and dying under the stars. Inside, the small lamp burned on, lighting up the papers, the tired chair, and one woman who refused to let this be the end, even as the real story behind their loss was only beginning to unfold.